Hello. Today I would like to talk about slow movements. How slow and how moving in the sense of traction forward towards an arrival point of each phrase while stretched when an instrument which is built on sound decay is the piano. And very often it's an aria for voice that is imitated on the piano. And the length of sound, therefore, of the arrival point of the long value has to come to blossom, but then while decaying, prepare intellectually ahead of time the articulation, the touch of the following note. Often after a tie, it's a faster group of notes. That is the tension of the long value rhythmically and a release of the short. So that's theoretical. Now let's see how it works. You want to avoid that. This is the slow movement of the Italian concerto by Bach, as I'm sure you recognized. That's right. What is wrong or right? Well, in my appreciation, the length of sound of the top A is dying. The longer you stay, the softer it is. So when you exit from that long note, creating a tension, and then the release with G, F, E, F, which are in shorter rhythmic values, you don't want to re-articulate it or restrike it like the first one, because then you have that accent. Unwilling, while your inner ear hears the tension build up, because musically there is a tension and release, like a voice would do vibrato. Silly to sing so high-pitched, but the point is that the voice sustains the sound naturally with the breath and the air, of course. So the wind instruments, so the vibrato for the string instruments, so it maintain the sound, or even enhance it by the vibrato, so it gives that a human voice quality to the string instruments. But there is also, of course, vibrato with the wind instruments naturally. Sometimes they start without, and then they add it towards the conclusion or the completion of that length and, I would say, value. And if it were on the piano, of course, it's unfeasible, but it would be fun to do. Not fun, weird, rather. So if you repeat fast the note, you don't get vibrato on the piano. Even if you strike it halfway in, you still hear a restriking, even if it's lesser than the full restriking. And the right foot pedal, of course, allows to lift all the 88 dampers. And the dampers, what do? Of course, they take off the sound closure by letting all the strings resonate fully, so you hear wah wah wah. So of course, if you exit that A, 2, 3, and then you recrescendo to the next long value, which is the E, and you leave it under the dynamic range in which the E has dropped. One has another leverage, is the tempo. How slow is a slow tempo? Before the 1820s, when Melzel marketed the metronome in Vienna, there was no objective way of defining a tempo by the composer at the get-go. I mean, how many beats a minute, sorry. But even so, we don't always respect the tempi of the composers because it's sometimes a fantasy of their imagination more than the reality of the performance in the action of the instrument or the interaction with other instruments in chamber music. So generally the idea is that the slow movement is some kind of a meditative statement or lyrical statement, both, as an aria imitating on the keyboard that predates the piano as an instrument, obviously, since the harpsichord did that already. And the fact is that when you make belief, you have to have some kind of persuasion. And I think the persuasion for the interpretation is built on the fact that if you manage to play, for instance, in the Bach slow movement of the concerto with which I started the example, in the left hand you have the bass note, and then of course the moving harmonically through thirds. You go from the tonic to second degree. In other words, you harmonize with left hand what you also play the bass note, tonic D. Now, if Bach had a middle pedal, he could have held the D indefinitely and then just play. We have this D ostinato, which he does all the time in his organ works. For instance, in C minor for organ, one of his fantasies, not so, I don't know the number from memory, but it doesn't matter. The example is that he has the capacity to hold the bass on the, most of the time, ostinato with the foot on the pedals, and of course thanks to the bellow manager who lifts and keeps in these non-electric city days of Bach's time, the pipes filled with air. But this kind of thing, when he does on the harpsichord, he either restrikes, either lets the performer decide where to restrike according to the length of the sound. And I think that the tempo, therefore, could help. The question is, what is the mood, the atmosphere, the meaning of a slow movement? And each slow movement has its own specificity, because obviously not all of them imitate an aria, though mostly, because of the singing nature of the instrument used for imitating the human voice. Of course, if you decide that adagio is at ease, as it used to be called in 2 letters and 2 words, or therefore andante being to take a walk, leisurely so. Andante is okay. Then you have adagio, a little bit slower, at least according to Melzel's metronome markings, because he decided to organize them in such graduation with the pendulum and the weight that moves on the metronome to change the amount of beats a minute. And so we have afterwards lento and grave. So yes, we can imagine that the indication of the composers, which is mostly for the mood and the atmosphere and the traction of the movement. Okay, and andante is obviously not so subdivided rhythmically as an adagio, but that is vague nevertheless. There is one famous danger in the slow movement, is to slow down as you go. So the problem is to maintain the pace, even if it's a very slow pace, but continuous. And therefore, the enemy of slow movements is the unevenness or the unexpected accentuation that comes out of an uncontrolled keyboard, or uncontrollable keyboard sometimes, when the notes don't respond with the same weight that you push by the finger each time. And if you can control the amount of unexpected accidental accents, asperities, edginesses. Then you have this kind of continuous flow that is the sort of mirror lake surface. So if I decide that I feel between the rapport of tempi of the first movement, which by the way Bach for this Italian concerto managed to not leave any mark of indication. It's always written on the programs without indication. Then the slow movement, before the last movement, the third movement, fast as well. It is fast, slow, fast was the Italian form at the time. So therefore the second movement is contrasting, obviously. So let's see if I can play it a little bit faster. Question: can I play faster and not sound agitated? Can I avoid unexpected bumps on the road like the accents I mentioned? Does it sound hasted? Compared to of course the right hand's legato quality matters the most. Quasi overlapping, but with light pedal and mostly not in passing tones or neighboring tones. Acoustics matter, of course the piano matters too, but you have still some margin of action by the very touch. In fact, the piano is the only instrument that is artificially able to play, so to say, not the natural pace of a slow tempo, which you naturally find in chamber music. An andante or an adagio with a string group of instruments or single string instrument or wind instrument, no matter how slower they feel the musicians who play those instruments, it should go in terms of their inspiration, their understanding, their culture of it. I mean, the context of the time period, the ornamentation, the decorations, the vibrato, how much, when. All these elements of good taste that you study about to define stylistically how to present the eloquent narrative storytelling. It's limited at some point in the spectrum of the options of tempo stretching or not by the capacity of the breath or the length of the bow and how slow the bow can hold in a single stroke all the amount of notes or the held note if there were one. And so inevitably the pianist playing chamber music with musicians who have this bow of breath, if not limitation, at least, well, it is partly, but it's not the way one had to think of it like that. It's more like what makes their specificity so beautiful. They're the singing instruments, the melodic instruments par excellence. And somehow the pianist comes to the chamber work with a certain idea of the mood, of the atmosphere. It's also valid for the concerti, because of course in the orchestra you have all these instruments, but many more. And so compromises have to be made. That's not a great fun word to say for interpretation with inspiration. But the piano allows alone, when played so, to stretch artificially the tempo because of the length of sound compared to the harpsichord, but also compared to the other earlier pianos for the right foot pedal that holds longer. And so if you are attentive at the decay at the end of a long value, especially if you stretch it beyond slow, a meditational, almost ecstatic slow, and I say that with a smile, but in fact it's very tempting. slow movement of the Schubert Sonata number, well, the last one. So instead of a single voice, Schubert uses a duet, mostly in thirds, but also in triton. And that length of sound is enhanced in its effect by the usage of an imitational pizzicato of strings instrument that is specifically separated by a lot of rests and air, during which you hear the resonance of the long value, the singing one. So if you were to play that movement so slower, the question is, should you? Not could you. Well, actually, could you is also part of the equation. But the point is should you matters. What is the point is not just ecstatically to recite syllables, but to make words and sentences and thoughts while keeping the mood atmosphere in this introspection. And in this case, Schubert wrote this originally to be a marching, a funeral march for Beethoven's funeral in 1827. So there's a kind of sense of procession with this contrasting accompaniment of the short values bathed in rests or interrupting the rests. 3, 4, a whole bar, 1, 2. Meanwhile, my melody dies now. Yes, that's the problem. Boom. An accent, unexpected, when you stretch to the point to which the sound dies before it's connected to the next. Even there is sometimes comma that you can do and restart. So aesthetically, who defines the right taste of the good choice? Of course, scholars, publishers, who put sometimes with their editors a tempo marking for pieces that didn't have such their first edition, mostly because of the lack of metronome. For an objective point of view, this tempo is a very subjective point of view. And of course, the length of sound, the acoustic, the instrument, but also the meter. I must say that music is to be read before it's to be played, while played is heard. And so the hearing is very important because it guides us for everything as musicians. It's our tuning fork, it's our good taste bellman. It's a way to organize our musical landscape when we present a piece as a solo pianist. The quality of the touch, the voicing, the reapplication of the sound inside the keys, to have the illusion of continuous resonance of each of the elements of the long phrase. And sometimes it's a mood thing. You can say, okay, it's written in 4/4, it's written in 4/8, it's written in 4/16. It doesn't always correspond to the tempo. Though the choice of the meter is the composer's choice, it's not random. It has to have some kind of visual incentive. When you look at the scores page, we see many 30 seconds, like in the first Viennese school. All slow movements are written with 16th notes and 30 seconds, but subdivided in adagio, like Mozart's K310 slow movement, or Beethoven's first sonata slow movement, in the same key and in the same inspiration. slow movements. Again, I will try now the Mozart sonata faster, but try to keep it as eloquently singing and well-being. Or in Beethoven. In this style of the first Viennese school of Haydn, early Beethoven, and of course Mozart, the ornaments also play a role of definition of that movement, traction, pacing, walking, if it were. Par excellence, they are not written rhythmically, so they're not defined in their rhythmic value, and they let the performer choose how to play, display. For instance, in the B section of the Beethoven slow movement, you have this turn. So because it's adagio, you think you have to spread it and sing it, or it could be. So when the composer is very picky about everything in their notation, and they should be, so we have the information to hope to reach the authenticity of their desire through the filter of their notation or their publishers, through the filter of our understanding, through all these interpretations before us, as the score was there and will be after us there, but the interpretations evolve and we have recordings to prove it. So we have a little bit more of wider resources to make our mind, unless all this is not really helpful. The only thing that matters is your intuition. When you play the piece, it's your turn to play the piece, regardless how it was played by the great old pianists or dead pianists, or how it will be played in the future. At some point you appropriate the meaning of it for yourself. It becomes your slow movement. So like a signature. You say, I sign my legato, I define my phrase length, 4 bars, 8 bars, 2 bars, 6 bars, whatever it is, in the way that you think you should build the exponential expansion of this melodic line until where, and then from there where forward. So it is true that at the end of all this explanation, it's a question of, I feel it like that. But that is not a definition for a lesson to teach a student. You have to give options. You have to explain how to understand intelligently the hints of the score's notation. And therefore, how to define, in this case, the ornaments, which are not rhythmized. Of course, there is no indication of how to play them, except in some treatises where they give us some options and some explanations. For instance, even as old as the treatise for expressive performance of the keyboard by C.P.E. Bach, Versuch in German for essay. Of course, it's related to a specific instrument, in that case, the harpsichord. But beyond that, we have some information about the we are very well informed, more than before nowadays, because of research on authentic instruments interpretation, therefore authentic interpretation of these original instruments, renditions of the pieces, which in a way dictate or tell the performer what tempo to take because of the bow length or the shape of it or the type of vibrato or lack of that was stylistically expected. And so when you do this kind of archaeological interpretation, but in present time, because after all it's always the fact of the now, the ephemeral moment of sharing the music, even if it's dipped in the understanding of how we think it's supposed to have been played. And we try to hear it with the ears of today, but for the ears that the people of yesterday heard it with. It is not the same, because we already used to hear more dissonances, more harsh elements of music compared to them, or perhaps even faster tempi, action, articulation, virtuosity. of the instrument evolving. So our ear is already not the one that prevailed, of course, in the time period of pieces we play. So it's not just the instrument that is to be authentic, it's the hearing that has to be authentic. But there is something universal about the pieces of the past, is that if we play them today, is that they mean to us something as if they are presently today. Therefore, they're inevitably translated or lost in translation on the modern piano. But it can be done with subtle and taste and faith into the honesty of saying, I want to play at this earnest what I think the piece is about on my favorite instrument, which happens to be the piano, even if it wasn't that type of piano or not even that type of keyboard on which that was written for. But the message of the piece seems more universal than only the instrument on which it was conceived, by the fact that people of the time lived in their own time, obviously. But we can always extrapolate and say, oh, what if Bach had the third pedal, as I said in the beginning? But in case he doesn't, there he has to restrike the ostinato to remind us that it's going on, or it's held. It's more of a hint of an ostinato, but it's there to remind us that it's still there, while on the organ you can hear it in continuous. So the tempi are to do with ultimately the capacity or the desire of the performer to choose how to project themselves towards an arrival point. If it's short term, it becomes a bit choppier. If it's long term, it becomes almost breathless. You feel like because there is no reason objectively to breathe on the piano. But we do, and I encourage, and I was encouraged as well in turn when I was a student, to mark a comma as if the singer takes breath to sing the next sentence or next phrase and next line and so on. And so, of course, the Romantic era of the 19th century in Europe was based on the very long idealization of a melodic line that is a run-on sentence. It doesn't reach right away or even later, sometimes never, or doesn't need to justify its expression through a tension build-up towards a climax. Sometimes it's just self-generated and continuously regenerating itself, and you feel like you enter in some, as a listener even, in some different atmosphere, some place where there is no ether, and all of a sudden you just hear an endlessly beautiful melodic line that doesn't want to end. Rachmaninoff does that, Chopin does that. Return to the tonic from which we started. But we went to the dominant, to second degree, to fourth degree. So we established the tonality, and we could also think that if we played with shorter breath, phrase here, ending, then you take the pedal off, and you strike the suspension, delaying the resolution, the passing tone, and then you tiny breathe to arrive to the subdominant, and again you breathe, second degree, 5, 6. instantly ending or dying, as a phrase. So, of course, if you do you can chop it in smaller pieces, especially because it's a slow tempo, therefore it's more stretched. You could do that for earlier music, for instance, Beethoven's D major sonata. Would say that where you stop the first phrase on the subdominant and then return to the tonic to the 6/4 perfect cadence. Then slow Alberti bass accompaniment. And then the aria. Finishing with the third and not to connect to an extension. Secondary dominance, secondary degrees. And cadence in C major. Redundance to repeat the pattern. And to end on C major, which in D minor is the flat 7th degree. With this German 6, you return to A minor. You insist in the redundance. Écossel, I like to call it. And the dominant of dominant. So you have an ending of this phrase on the dominant in minor. And the German 6 again. Diminished sevenths to go back to D minor. You see how perhaps, and that I think is to do with the German Romanticism, when the composers like Schumann, who was very interested not only in music, but all of them were the poetry of their language. And the German's syntax happens to have the verb at the end of the sentence, which creates a sense of longing because of the point that you want to make. Until you finish the sentence, you'll only know if the action is present, past, or future. And therefore, in that longing, that expectation, you can dwell and tense in syncopations, secondary dominance. You just don't want to even end the phrase because you want to stay in this tension, but also tender expectation of the hope that perhaps your feelings are returned, and that's often in the Romantic era in Chopin too. You want to make sure that I advise at least not to make an ending on each group of short bars, but still continue the thought. After the dominant, relative major. Sadness of no hope because it's returned to G minor. But in this case, Chopin proceeds by short groups of sentences. Of course, played like this, it doesn't have any meaning for the atmosphere because you cannot play that fast. Pure music on top of it. It's not like program music. You can hardly play the funeral march of his sonata. B flat minor, reasonably fast. It's very difficult to to be truthfully believable, because obviously you don't haste in a funeral march. But how much do you drag in it? It's also another question. Of course, in a program music like a march, you have a procession, therefore the steps, and the melody can die, but the melody is not like an aria where it's all about the melody. It's a melody on a steps motion of a slow procession. How slow? Perhaps less. And at some point it becomes impossible to go faster. But in the case of this ballad, there is no... Of course, we associate all kinds of expressions and analogies with life, love, breath, hope, sigh, all moods, because it's so incredibly talking while not specifically saying to our soul what it says or conveys for our psyches to connect to it or recognize and mirror with it as a listener, but also as a performer. And of course, because in that case there is no indication of what illustrative of human feelings music this is, specifically in the action of a funeral march, then yes, it's just pure music, and you can stretch it as much as you think it should. So the point of the story of all that is that I noticed since I was very young, probably between 7 and 12, basically, during my 5 years, first 5 years studying with Mademoiselle Boulanger in Paris, I had the opportunity, the luck, the generous, incredibly hardworking as well opportunity to, what opportunity? Luck. Inspirational, unbelievable moments to work with the greats of the past. That was Yehudi Menuhin, playing Brahms sonata. That was, for instance, that case you learn as you go while you play. You're not the equal of these grades when you're a child, be it prodigy. And thankfully my parents made sure I knew that, as well as my teacher. But while I was playing with my intuition, with my understanding, or lack of too much understanding when you're young like that. And so I followed the tempo of Menuhin. I remember we did the slow movement of the Brahms sonata. And of course the perfect pitch helps to also not only connect the importance of the definition of the pitch of the note, but you're very sensitive, like for a foreign language that you learn by ear before you read the grammar and all, to what he does on the violin. So I was following, of course. I didn't try to impose a tempo. Besides, I didn't know which tempo to have. I just knew it was, I felt, rather knew, as an intuitive musician that we all are when we are connected to the sensitivity to the very text, to the meaning of it. Why do we even deal with music if it doesn't mean to us? Because it means to us, then we think we have to really mean it in our interpretation. And I noticed then already that was a great lesson for slow movements, is that the 70, 80, 90-year-olds of the early 70s when I was there were of course educated in the early 20th century or even late 19th century, for this generation of them. And I noticed by making it while I was playing, and I was learning in playing, in fact, it was like a lesson / rehearsal for a concert, that Menuhin doesn't play slow, the slow movements. So before I had to play with him, of course I learned the piano part by myself, like all pianists do when they prepare before a chamber performance. So I was doing... about style because it's too early to know, but I intuitively understood how grave and with certain gravitas, that's what it is. But I didn't know the word then. But anyway, I felt it, that it has this kind of noble slow traction of the movement of the pace. And to me, because of the piano and the pedal, I could work on my legato or my soft basses, deep but not accented. And that was not a little challenge when you're not having technical capacity to control your touch. And so anyway, first rehearsal, boom, reality. He plays really not slow. Vibrato, singing, sliding, especially the thirds in the middle section. Anyway, I just discovered the soundscape that he produced, and I just quoted him because I followed him like I do when I accompany a singer like Gérard Souzet, as I did too. He was a famous French baritone. And of course the breadth of the singer, the length of the bow, the vibrato, etc. And so I adapted to it, and I realized that in fact we played it in a flow, in a walk, in a pace. As Richter would tell me, breathe or smell rather every second rose in the garden. It's a way to say don't just stay ecstatically on each note, even if each of them is so beautiful, meaningful, poetic, expressive. So I realized that the old generation played slow tempi faster. And the young generation, as I grew up with my peers at the Paris Conservatory, I felt like we were always trying to play the slow movements deep because they mean to us and want to express our musicianship through them, which, or whatever the music makes us vibrate with our musicianship, to extend it to the max, because I thought, I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues, just myself, that because I'm on the piano, I can therefore do what I just showed you earlier. In some kind of a meditational stretch of the tempo, which the instrument allows. And then I tried to think, okay, can I play it faster and still remain in the same ecstatic, but I continues to think that it was ecstatic. Versus so the choice of the tempo at the get-go is one thing, but to be able to start in a given tempo and maintain it. Mademoiselle Boulanger used to tell me, even if you start in the wrong tempo, you have to hold it till the end and make sense of it, even if it wasn't your choice, but perhaps by lack of concentration or the response of the instrument. She didn't explain why, but let's say you started in a tempo you cannot sustain, basically. You still have to deal with it. And you cannot just readjust it while you go through it. That was a big no-no for her. You had to go through the different sections, because there are B sections and other things in the moods. For instance, the middle section of this sonata, slow movement, it's either a chorale or a brass imitation, or then the aria. And Schubert gives us both options in that B section, which could be played faster compared to how slower the A section would have been. He doesn't indicate a difference of tempo, but inevitably, if you start very slow for whichever reasons, again, motivating you just do this, then it's very difficult to do that in the middle section, which is less ecstatic and more reassuringly singing in relative major. Totally unnatural for a singer to do. Change the tempo in the tectonic structures of the tectonic, rather, like for the earth crests. If you take the first section, the A section is an adagio or an andante. So if you do this tempo, the B section, you just don't change the pace. You're in the same pace. You just change the character. Except that when I was young, I thought, oh, it's too fast for the meditational opening and too slow if it were to be the slow meditation opening. And so when I asked Mademoiselle Boulanger, should I change, can I, or am I allowed to, how students ask the question as if there is a binary answer, yes, no. Sometimes it's gray area, but anyway, I asked her, am I allowed to change the tempo into a faster tempo for the B section? And she answered by asking me, what do you hear? So philosophers answer by a question. In this situation doesn't get solved on the spot. You cannot say, okay, well, I define it because I heard somebody I liked on YouTube University, or as I like to call it, or the publisher says this, the metronomic marking, regardless that Schubert didn't indicate it himself, is by the publisher and it's educated knowledge, and this is how to be informed performance, and even if it's on the modern piano and da 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 da. Okay, all that said, you have to make a choice on the spot. When you play, where you play. You're not responsible for the architecture of the building, of the place in which you play. Some say, oh, it's too resonant. Some say it's boomy. Some say, no, it's dry. Some say, oh, you need to play slower or faster with less pedal for clarity. But you really practice this piece for years or months or weeks or days or hours or lifetime, all lifelong in 1 hour of performing. And so you put in your experience of having played it in different tempi in front of an audience, and then your intuition of the moment, but you still played on the spur of the moment with an incredible quality, which I think makes a live performance so meaningful to audiences, sometimes cruel to the performer, is that it's the ephemeral moment of now and the spontaneity of the moment, regardless how much you have organized, thought, read, analyzed, discussed, understood, defined, dissected basically every detail of the patterns, of the rhythm choices, of the meter choice, of the indication choice, of the mood that comes out of it. And all these elements that I spoke about, somehow they just disappear. They disappear, and you just sit in front of the piano. People are waiting, holding their breath, and you have to go ahead and start. So you don't have to give an upbeat, because you're not a musician who doesn't play as the conductor is, to make the others play or start together and then pull them not to slow down by beating always ahead of time. So you have to count then independently if you're your own conductor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, then you might not be able to sing because you don't play. Obviously, if you count it in order to subdivide it so that you keep the tempo from slowing down, because if you count slow, the long values, 1, 2, 3, you start singing, counting 2, and you follow you're playing like you follow the dog on the leash because you don't direct the events. So the conductor gives the tempo, gives the upbeat. It would be silly to give one's own upbeat when you play solo. When you play chamber music, you look at each other and you do this, and then you start. And the first thing that the conductor learns is that to give an upbeat in the exact tempo of the downbeat to follow, and all the next downbeats of the next bars to follow. Because pianists don't think about the pulse and the upbeat and the tempo before they start. They, in a way, adjust to the tempo according to their tactile finger sensation, digital memory. So and these different examples show that if all of the above is erased and evaporated and just left, it's only your musical instinct, your intuition, your spontaneous performance of the moment, tainted more or less by your nervousness if you are on stage. That also is unfortunately a factor to deal with. But generally speaking, you don't analyze yourself playing a slow movement, you play the slow movement. And of course, if you play with other musicians, you're sort of on their tracks, and therefore you keep the pace for them and they for you. So you hold each other in going through the sections. But in the solo piano playing, unless orchestra has a conductor, but when you're soloist, you don't have a conductor just for you, well, it'll be actually a great luxury. You have to count yourself. You have to maintain the pace, the structure, the architectural blueprint of the piece that you sort of create ephemerally in front of the audience, and it reveals itself differently because of the acoustics of the instrument, but you still have an inner ear that projects you to what you fantasized it should be. Of course, if the instrument allows you to explore some stretches, you have to define if, because you can, you should or not. In other words, don't play pretty full, but meaningful. By directing the attention of the listener by the quarter notes of the connected song of the melody of the beginning of Sonata Opus 109 by Beethoven, rather than the pleasant arpeggiation of the chords for the prettiness. But there are stems up. So in a way you sing a song and you play an accompaniment all in the same time, even if it's a song without words by essence. And of course, in this case, Beethoven starts on an upbeat. But he purposely makes all the other beats after it alike. So you don't know as a listener, unless you have the visual of the score, that this starts on an upbeat. You think is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's satisfactory for the uninformed listener. So how does a performer subtly hint in their interpretation that you start on an upbeat, which is preceded by the silence of before the music? So you would give perhaps a little bit of an impulse on the downbeat that follows the upbeat. But then you start breaking the incredibly ethereal line of Beethoven, who didn't define the upbeat and the downbeat. And so if you do, I think it's no more meaningful, it's reductive. So in this pre-romantic era of late Beethoven, the long sentences, the stretched phrases, the floating impression of the pulse, there is no downbeat, upbeat, you're some kind of in some kind of flotation. You're neither or up or down, you're just somewhere. Like in his Sonata 101 when he goes... The syncopation slurred, but it just appears like long values. beautiful is just the ecstatic beauty of each element, but it's no more a sentence. It's just beautiful sounds that don't connect into a meaning. Of course, you can enjoy it as a foreign language you don't speak, but you like the poetry of the sound of the words. Or if not right, like perhaps you're curious, or perhaps you're amused, or sometimes puzzled how they use the diphthongs and the throat and the nasal resonances, how the very language expresses through their thoughts, which is the point of a language. That's why the meaningful part is the point of the language, and the prettiful is the poetry of the sound of the words themselves. They're music before music. The way you say the sounds, or you prolong the vowels, or you have the nasal or the throat. So you don't, I mean, of course, all these elements can be taken all separately to define ideologically your point of view and say, because I like it to be this way, I'm going to play that tempo because I think that's the truth and that's supposed to be like this and everybody else is wrong. That's not my attitude. I still think that you have to have your own, and I do, convictions, but that you need to stay very humble to discover that there are other ways of seeing the piece, or other entrances into that path of the piece than the one that you usually have taken because of experience or just your way. And I think that while there is not an infinite amount of interpretations in terms of tempo choices, there is a margin within which you can explore the capacity to bring to the horizon line the phrase that you had started. And I find that if you only think analytically, you might not be very interesting as a stage performer. But if you only feel the music without defining guidelines before you play the piece, how you're going to go through it in terms of what pace, what track of the pace, how will I sound elegant and calm, or elegant and agitated, or it depends of the section, of course. If there's a dramatic and some happy. The slow movement of the D minor concerto by Mozart has, in this case, and rarely so, a very different tempo for the B section. Dramatic G minor contrasting with the relative major opening aria. You're given very little choice here because you cannot go in the same tempo. Then you artificially try to match in an ideology of same tempo for the whole movement, but I think when the contrast of the mood is so strikingly obvious in the genres that the keyboard instrument imitates, would it be aria or toccata in this case, for instance, it's sort of silly to try to play it in the same tempo. In the Schubert sonata slow movement, if you can play it reasonably fast while keeping it extremely calm and meditational, then you can almost do the different color atmosphere, but keeping the same pace. Or if not, you'll take a slower tempo, which you might control better the resonance and the length of sound and the articulation. And when you arrive this, gently pick a faster tempo, less slow, but still keep very, very even so that you don't have agitation, accents that give you a sense of agitation. So what I learned as a child prodigy with old men and women as teachers or sometimes performers is that the old people don't play slow movement slow, but still very deep, because they control, I think, better with their experience, whichever instrument they play, the stretch and the organization of their phrasing towards the horizon line without unexpected bumps on the road. If not, you play a tempo, like when you drive through a road that has speed bumps to slow down your pace. You're obliged to go slow in order not to be bumped too hard in the car. It's not bumper cars, right? So the slower tempo is often, I think, an idealization of something beyond the beauty of what supposedly the natural pace of it is supposed to be. And when I say supposed to be, is because sometimes, because we play on the piano an instrument that doesn't have per se a limitation. Of course, it does have the decay as a limitation, but it's a delayed decay with pedal, delayed decay with acoustics, delayed decay with some pianos that are voiced so that they can hold longer sounds in comparison to others. So you have to deal with the unexpected in many ways. First of all, your own self, but also the instrument on which you play. You hardly play the same instrument every time if you're a pianist, unless you're rich. And in a way, it's not practical either to transport. It's not good for the instrument. So you have to adapt and adjust on different instruments. And no matter how good they are, if they are, they're different. And that means that you have to adapt to obtain what your inner ear or your inner visual imagination of this ephemeral construction that you produce in front of the audience of the piece calls for. And sometimes the piece reveals itself differently because some of these parameters which you more or less control, more than less, plus for those who do get stage fright, you have to add to that shortness of breath, less breathing, therefore less irrigation of blood from in the brain. Therefore, it's not the same. Finally, as a teacher, I like to think that it's very useful if you play a slow movement, that you don't know how slower to stretch in order to be in the right expectance of it. You try to play it as a moderato tempo, which is not. For instance, in the Tempest Sonata slow movement, if you play it as a fast movement, very clearly the group of of bars in a phrase, but when it's played slow, it's all these spaces between the notes that bring that sense incredibly so of meditational aspect, introspective. How fast the ornament. Because in the beginning of the movement it's all in long values, when it comes in the recapitulation you have the subdivisions. So in a way that is where the track of the tempo comes very naturally, but in the beginning it's so empty and slow. So by teaching how to find the right natural slow tempo without to be overly slow nor hectically fast, regardless of the choices also of the capacities of controlling it, it helps to think how the phrase naturally leads to the next phrase is by playing it fast. I know it's silly, of course it's an exercise, but it brings you to understand, okay, I'm going to go to this group of bars by 4 or 2 or 6 or 8 or whatever, and when I play it slow, I'm going to still not let the slow tempo let me lose the point of what I'm saying, because I'm syllabically reciting it. And if I count as a subdivided conductor, I will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 7, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, people do that in their mouth. They chew the tempo to sort of say articulate the short value that defines the multiplication for the large value, rather than thinking in large values or counting, singing like, and then not knowing exactly the proportions when you're so stretched between the second and third beat. You go 1, 2, 3, or but if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1. So if you can separate the independence of your counting, dry and let's say intentionally non-musical counting, objective, but you're playing super subjective, legato, singing, as if these silences are these philosophical spaces where you sink in your thoughts. That's what you present to the audience, the interrupted silences of music. And if they know that inside you think, that's silly, right? Like some kind of a metronome inside you as a conductor and a you performer. No. Well, actually, if you can, that would be fine, because then you could define the playing for its character of the music as you like it to be, or you wish it to be, and you work towards making it to be, while your counting allows for the structure to be always there. In other words, you define the space, but then you still cover the space with the singing. So when I was recording the Debussy sonata with French violinist Patrice Fontana-Rosa, I asked him, Maître, when will we rehearse? And he told me, I think it's a lifetime or an hour. And I think that after having spoken to you different aspects of my food for thought thinking process about different elements that nourish that thought process of which tempo to take in a slow movement, at the end of it is only what happens on the spot when you perform it. The piece itself becomes again what it is, which is marvelous, and you try not to make it suffer, regardless if you reach the idealization of your projection before you play it or not. Well, or not is disappointing, obviously. But I find that fascinating. That is not a question of speed, of tempo. It's a question of mood, character, and capacity to maintain the pace with touch in the phrasing, in the legato, and in other words, prettyful and meaningful, not just ecstatic for the sake of it, nor faster because ideologically. No, it should be the moment of putting your inner musicianship in unison with your outer interpretation musicianship, and hoping that the two match and reach the audience. And the audience and you become one with the piece while you hear it. They hear it, you hear and perform it. Although this is so easy to say, this process is not so simple, even if it's easy to put in words. But I find everybody defines that by themselves. That's marvelous. So that means there's not a single way that is right. The tradition of the Germanic tempo, the tradition of the Italianate, the tradition of the French, the ornament, the instrument, the acoustic, all this is good, but it's just the spur of the moment. Sometimes you just go and you go, that moment, isn't it? For which we live so much all our lives for. Thank you.